The morning of August 16, 1977, started like any other for the maids at Graceland, but by noon everything had changed. The news spread like wildfire. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was dead. His body was found in the bathroom, lifeless and cold. The world was in shock, but for Detective Larry Hutchinson, this was just the beginning of a dark and complex mystery. Hutchinson, along with his partners David McGriff and Bobby Armstead, had been assigned to the case. They were determined to uncover the truth behind Elvis's sudden death. The initial reports were vague, but one thing was clear: something didn't add up. As the investigation unfolded, the detectives learned that Elvis's last days were filled with turmoil and secrets. They had a lead, a little-known girlfriend named Alicia Kerwin, who had dated Elvis during the same time he was seeing Ginger Alden. Alicia was smart and had a unique perspective on Elvis's life during those final months. The detectives traveled to Las Vegas, where Alicia was working as a blackjack dealer. They were referred to a local officer named Rick, who looked more like a card sharp than a detective. Rick revealed that Dr. Elias Gainham, a reserve Las Vegas policeman and Elvis's personal doctor, was well connected and had no interest in talking to them. Despite the obstacles, the detectives managed to secure an interview with Alicia. She arrived at the police station in her Mustang convertible, ready to share her story. Alicia had met Elvis in April 1977 through a mutual friend, George Klein. She recalled her first visit to Graceland, where she met Elvis late at night. He was kind and gentlemanly, but as their relationship progressed, things changed. Alicia described a second meeting where Elvis seemed more despondent, especially after his daughter, Lisa Marie, had left for the day. She remembered the pill bottles around the mansion and the obsequious behavior of Elvis's entourage. The atmosphere was tense, and Alicia felt uncomfortable with the way Elvis's friends treated him. Their relationship took a turn when Elvis invited Alicia to Las Vegas. During the flight, she noticed a change in his demeanor. He seemed sluggish and was taking various medications. In Las Vegas, Dr. Gainham visited Elvis daily, and Alicia observed the doctor's influence over the singer. Alicia and Elvis then traveled to Palm Springs, but their trip was cut short when Elvis's father and manager, the Colonel, called, upset that they couldn't find Elvis. This led to a series of phone calls and a growing sense of depression in Elvis. Back in Memphis, Alicia decided to break off the relationship. She felt it was too much for her to handle, especially with the constant presence of people around Elvis. She described her last visits to Graceland, where Elvis seemed more depressed and lonely than ever. Alicia's insights painted a picture of a man deeply troubled and dependent on medications. She believed Elvis was taking more pills than he should, and suspected he was addicted. The detectives were struck by her honesty and the details she provided, which added a new layer to their investigation. As the interview concluded, Alicia began to cry, sharing a personal detail that the detectives hadn't asked about. Despite the time they spent together, she and Elvis never had a sexual relationship. The detectives believed her, and her story provided a crucial piece of the puzzle in their quest to understand Elvis's final days. The investigation was far from over, but each piece of information brought them closer to the truth. The maids at Graceland, the doctors, and the people closest to Elvis all held pieces of the puzzle, and Hutchinson and his team were determined to put them together. The king was dead, but the mystery of his death was only just beginning to unravel. The courtroom was buzzing with excitement as the trial of Dr. George Nichopoulos began. Judge Bernie Weinman, a kind but somewhat clumsy figure, had set the trial for September 29, 1981. But he soon realized his mistake. It was Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Sheepishly, he rescheduled the trial for the next day, much to the amusement of his colleagues. The trial was expected to be a big deal, with lots of drama and new revelations about Elvis Presley. But as it turned out, the proceedings were often dull and confusing. Judge Weinman's rambling and indecisive style didn't help. He often left the lawyers and the audience bewildered with his broken sentences and unclear rulings. James Neal, a famous lawyer from Nashville, stepped in to lead the defense. Known for his meticulous preparation, Neal was not the flashy type, but was highly respected. He had been pulled away from a poker game to take the case, but the hefty fee convinced him to join. Nichopoulos, with the help of the Greek community in Memphis, had raised about $150,000 to hire Neil. Before the trial started, Larry Hutchinson, one of the key investigators, received a disturbing call. An anonymous tipster claimed that a group was planning to hire a hitman to kill Hutchinson. The tipster said the group included a judge, lawyers, and other prominent citizens. Hutchinson took the threat seriously, always carrying his gun and taking extra precautions. On the prosecution side, Jewett Miller, a tough and experienced prosecutor, was leading the charge. Miller was passionate about the case, seeing it as a fight against drug abuse and the crimes it often caused. However, his aggressive style wasn't always the best fit for the trial. The selection of the jury took 2 weeks. The panel was made up of ordinary people from various walks of life, including a grocery cashier, a waitress, and a secretary. One juror, a nurse's aide, was eventually excused because she couldn't find childcare. Another juror, who knew Elvis personally, was dismissed after bailiffs discovered his connection. The prosecution accused Dr. Nichopoulos of over-prescribing drugs to 10 patients, including Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. The case also involved a group of close friends who frequently visited Nichopoulos' office for prescription refills. The prosecution argued that Nichopoulos had failed to follow accepted medical standards and was well below the line of what was considered acceptable. James Neal, on the other hand, focused on Dr. Nichopoulos' intentions. He argued that Nichopoulos was trying to help his patients, especially Elvis, who had many personal problems. Neal portrayed Nichopoulos as a good Samaritan rather than a criminal. The trial began with Robert Muehlberger, a handwriting expert, testifying that most of the prescriptions were indeed written by Nichopoulos. However, some prescriptions for Jerry Lee Lewis had been altered to increase the dosages. During a recess, Neal complained about the prosecutor's strategy, feeling blindsided by the introduction of Nichopoulos' vulgar handwriting sample. Jack Kirsch, the pharmacist who filled many of the prescriptions, was next. He had already faced his own legal troubles for supplying Elvis with a large quantity of drugs. Kirsch confirmed that Nichopoulos often called in prescriptions without signatures. On cross-examination, Neal asked Kirsch about Nichopoulos' efforts to control Elvis's drug use. Kirsch revealed that Nichopoulos had intercepted drugs from other sources, and even brought them to Kirsch to identify. Marty Lacker, a close friend of Elvis, was a reluctant witness. He had written a book about his own drug dependence, which had helped investigators find more prescriptions. Despite the high number of sleeping pills he received, Lacker insisted he wasn't a drug addict, just someone who needed help to sleep. His wife, Patsy, however, was more critical, recalling how she had begged Nichopoulos to stop prescribing sleeping pills for Marty, but he ignored her. Patsy Gamble, Elvis's cousin and longtime bookkeeper, testified about the payments made to Dr. Nichopoulos. The checks showed that Nichopoulos was paid $800 a day while on tour with Elvis. Gamble also noted how Elvis's handwriting had deteriorated, and he had become more reclusive. The prosecution then presented the toxicology report from Bioscience Laboratories. Dr. Norman Weissman, the chief toxicologist, took the stand. The courtroom was filled with reporters, eager to hear the details of Elvis's drug use. Weissman's testimony promised to shed light on the circumstances of Elvis's death, a mystery that had captivated the public for years. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case was about more than just one doctor and his patients. It was a reflection of the larger issues surrounding fame, addiction, and the responsibilities of those in positions of trust. The jury, made up of ordinary people, would have to decide if Dr. Nichopoulos had crossed the line or if his intentions were genuinely to help. The courtroom was quiet as Dr. Weissman, a biochemist, slowly detailed the drugs found in Elvis's blood. He explained that there were 14 different drugs, including 3 that were breakdown products of other drugs. He mentioned that 2 of these drugs, codeine and methaqualone, were found in amounts that were much higher than what doctors usually prescribe. Codeine, for example, was 10 times higher than it should have been. But the judge, Bernie Weinman, cut the conversation short. He said that what these drugs did to Elvis's body wasn't important for the case. He even pointed out that Dr. Weissman wasn't a medical doctor, so he couldn't say much about how the drugs affected Elvis. Next, the prosecution called Dr. Eric Muirhead, a top doctor who had signed the autopsy report. He was an expert on heart disease and had worked at Baptist Hospital. But the judge only let him talk about the basic facts, like how the blood samples from Elvis were sent to a lab and what the lab found. He wasn't allowed to say what caused Elvis's death. This made the trial feel a bit less exciting. Instead of focusing on Elvis's death, the trial became more about whether Dr. Nichopoulos, who had given Elvis all these drugs, was a bad doctor. The prosecution started calling other doctors to talk about the prescriptions Nichopoulos had written. They wanted to show that he wasn't following good medical practices. One of the best witnesses was Dr. David Knott, who had treated both Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis. At first, he didn't want to testify, but the court made him. He said that Nichopoulos was trying to help Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis get off drugs, but the amounts and types of drugs they were taking were still too much. Dr. Knott was surprised by the huge number of drugs Nichopoulos had prescribed to Elvis. When the prosecution asked Dr. Knott if he thought Nichopoulos was trying to help his patients, Knott said yes. This was a big help to Nichopoulos' defense. Another doctor, Dr. William Lerner, talked about how to treat drug addiction. He said that the best way was to slowly reduce the amount of drugs a person takes while giving them weaker drugs, controlling where they get drugs from, and providing long-term therapy. But when Dr. Lerner couldn't remember which medical journal he had written for, the defense lawyer, Jim Neal, made fun of him. This made the courtroom laugh and undermined the prosecution's case. The prosecution then called 5 Memphis doctors to talk about how bad Nichopoulos' methods were. Dr. Alvin Cummins, who was one of the strongest witnesses, said that the amounts and combinations of drugs Nichopoulos prescribed were dangerous. But the prosecution had to go through each case in detail, which made the trial drag on. Sometimes the doctors didn't agree with each other, which confused the jury. The defense lawyer, Jim Neal, showed his impatience and the jury started to lose interest. When the prosecution rested its case, Neal pointed out that they hadn't called Elvis's ex-girlfriend, Linda Thompson, to testify. He argued that the state had been unfair by delaying the trial when she was pregnant. The judge denied this, but he made Linda stay in Tennessee just in case. The judge also dismissed some of the charges against Nichopoulos, saying that doctors often prescribe medicine to themselves, which is what one of the charges was about. The defense then started its case. They called Dr. Walter Hoffman, who talked about how Nichopoulos was compassionate and tried to help his patients. Another witness, Al Strada, said that he and Nichopoulos often gave Elvis fake pills to help him. The star witness for the defense was Dr. Forrest Tennant, Jr. from Los Angeles. He talked about a new way to treat drug addiction called drug maintenance. This means giving patients drugs to keep them functioning, instead of trying to get them off drugs completely. Tennant said this was a good and modern way to treat addiction, especially for someone like Elvis. Finally, Nichopoulos himself took the stand. He said that his goal was always to help his patients, and that he did the best he could with Elvis. When the prosecution cross-examined him, they tried to make him look bad, but Nichopoulos came across as a doctor who was just trying to help. The jury ended up believing Nichopoulos and acquitted him on all charges. After the trial, Nichopoulos said he felt he had done a poor job in front of the medical board in 1980, but that the criminal trial proved his innocence. Elvis's life, in the end, was about trying to control things he couldn't. He used drugs to deal with his problems, but the drugs only made things worse. His music, health, and personal life all suffered because of his addiction. Even his friends and entourage didn't want to question his choices, as long as they kept getting paid. After Elvis died, the people around him, like Jerry T. Francisco, tried to protect his legacy. Francisco argued that the drugs and prescriptions had nothing to do with Elvis's death. He complained about how the press exaggerated the story and invaded privacy. But deep down, it seemed like he was trying to protect Elvis's image and his own reputation. The story of Elvis's last years and his death is a reminder that even the most famous and talented people can struggle with things they can't control. The case of Elvis Presley's death is a tangled web of secrets, legal battles, and unanswered questions. At the center of this web is Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner. Dr. Francisco's actions in the days following Elvis's death have been scrutinized and debated for decades. The main controversy revolves around how much information he should have revealed to the public and the authorities. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, the world was in shock. Fans, family, and the media all wanted to know what happened. Dr. Francisco, who was in charge of the autopsy, made a crucial decision. He kept the full autopsy report private. He claimed that the autopsy was a private record, protected by confidentiality laws, because the local prosecutor hadn't formally ordered it. This move was controversial because it meant that the public, the media, and even the authorities didn't get the full story. Many people, including the district attorney and the grand jury, missed out on important evidence that could have shed light on the circumstances of Elvis's death. The autopsy report contained overwhelming evidence of drug abuse, which could have led to further investigations and possibly even criminal charges. Instead, Dr. Francisco's decision to keep the report private allowed the case to fester and remain open to speculation. The press and the public were left to speculate about what really happened. Some believed that Elvis died from a drug overdose, while others thought it was a natural death. The lack of transparency only fueled the rumors and conspiracy theories. Dr. Francisco's decision also meant that the Presley family, who wanted to protect their privacy, didn't have to face the full extent of the public scrutiny. In 1981, ABC 2020 program tried to get the full autopsy report through a lawsuit. The case went all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, but the court ultimately ruled in favor of Dr. Francisco and the Shelby County Medical Examiner's Office. The justices accepted Francisco's argument that he was acting as a private consultant, not a public official, when he conducted the autopsy. This decision meant that the full autopsy report would remain sealed. Despite the court's ruling, the story didn't end there. Journalists and authors continued to dig for the truth. One of them was Albert Goldman, who wrote a controversial biography of Elvis. Goldman claimed that Elvis died from a drug overdose, and even suggested that he might have committed suicide. However, his book contained several factual errors and relied heavily on speculation. Goldman's theories were later debunked by more accurate information that came to light. Years later, Dr. George Nichopoulos, who was Elvis's personal physician, added to the confusion by suggesting that Elvis might have been murdered. Dr. Nick's theory was that Elvis was killed by a karate chop to the neck, and he even named David Stanley, one of Elvis's bodyguards, as a potential suspect. However, this theory was quickly dismissed by other experts, including Dr. Francisco, who pointed out that the autopsy showed no signs of foul play. The debate over how much a medical examiner should reveal continues. In the case of Elvis Presley, the decision to keep the autopsy report private had far-reaching consequences. It prevented the full truth from being known and allowed the mystery to persist. If Dr. Francisco had acted more transparently, the case might have been laid to rest much sooner. Instead, it remains a topic of fascination and debate, with new theories and claims emerging even decades later. Every year, as fans gather in Memphis to commemorate Elvis's life and death, the questions about what really happened on that fateful day in August 1977 still linger. The story of Elvis Presley's death is a reminder of the importance of transparency and accountability, especially in cases involving public figures. In 1989, Charlie Thompson left the TV show 2020 to join 60 Minutes. One day, while investigating a story in Miami, he met a lawyer named Ellis Rubin. They started talking about Elvis Presley. Rubin mentioned a writer named Derry Matura, who had a beef with Geraldo Rivera. Matura was so upset about something, Rivera said in an interview that he hired Rubin to sue Rivera for damages. Rubin told Thompson that Matura didn't have much of a case. Geraldo Rivera was still talking about Elvis on his show. In late 1989, Billy Stanley appeared on Geraldo to promote his new book, Elvis, My Brother. Billy claimed his first wife, Anne, had an affair with Elvis. He also said his book showed Elvis in a better light. In September 1988, Memphis Magazine published an article about the Shelby County Medical Examiner's Office. The article criticized the office and suggested it needed changes. The article mentioned Dr. Jerry Francisco, who was in charge at the time. Francisco didn't cooperate with the magazine, but the article still included a section about Elvis Presley's death. Dr. Ronald K. Wright, a medical examiner from Florida, read the article and wrote a letter to the magazine. Wright said he reviewed Francisco's work on Elvis's death and agreed with Francisco's conclusion that Elvis died from heart disease. Wright called Francisco honest and reliable. However, the actual file at the medical examiner's office only had a short form and a press release about Elvis's death. This made people wonder what else Wright might have seen to agree so strongly with Francisco. Dr. Harold Sexton, who was part of the team that did Elvis's autopsy, passed away in 1988. Before he died, Sexton gave some confidential information to an intermediary, who then passed it on to a researcher named Cole. This information was important because it shed light on what really happened during the autopsy. Dan Warlick, a lawyer who had been involved in the Elvis case, wanted to remember his role in it. He reached out to Cole and asked for a copy of a drawing used in the 2020 broadcast. The drawing showed a note that read, Ep Ad Doabi Mach, which meant Elvis Presley overdose, dead on arrival Baptist Memorial Hospital. It took a while, but Warlick, Cole, and Charlie Thompson finally met to talk about Elvis's death. Warlick had his deposition from the 2020 lawsuit on his desk. He explained that he had seen and heard things at Graceland, and during the autopsy that were crucial to understanding what happened. Warlick described how he went to Graceland and noticed that the bathroom had been cleaned, but he found a spot on the carpet where Elvis's head had been. He lay down on the carpet to see where Elvis's feet would have been if he had fallen off the toilet. The distance suggested Elvis had crawled before he died. Warlick also remembered a book on the bathroom counter that had been knocked over, and he believed Elvis had thrown it in his final moments. He found syringes and an empty medical bag in Elvis's living quarters, which made him suspect drugs were involved. During the autopsy, Warlick learned that Elvis's intestines were clogged with hardened feces. He believed Elvis died from a condition called a Valsalva maneuver, where the strain of trying to go to the bathroom increased pressure in his abdomen, which stopped his heart. Warlick thought Elvis knew he was dying and struggled before he passed away. Cole and Thompson listened intently, even though they had different theories. Cole believed the Baptist hospital theory, that a mix of drugs caused Elvis's death. Warlick argued that while drugs were a factor, the Valsalva maneuver was the main cause. Later, Thompson and Cole met with Larry Hutchinson and David McGriff, who had also been involved in the Elvis case. Hutchinson had a different theory. He thought Elvis had a seizure and struggled to breathe, eventually suffocating on the thick carpet. Despite their different ideas, everyone agreed that Francisco's ruling that drugs played no role in Elvis's death was wrong. They decided to work together to uncover the truth about Elvis's death. For 10 years, Thompson and Cole had been following the trail of Dr. John Fiegel, a man who had often helped them with stories that had nothing to do with Elvis. Fiegel had once been an associate medical examiner in Atlanta, but had moved to Tampa, where he turned an old fire station into a law office. He specialized in medical malpractice cases, just like Warlick did. When new information about Elvis's death started coming in, Thompson and Cole began calling Fiegel more often. Fiegel had seen all the evidence they had gathered, and he didn't agree with the theories of Warlick and Hutchinson. Those theories are pretty far-fetched, Fiegel said. If you ask me, it's all about polypharmacy. It's a solid diagnosis. Just because Jerry Francisco didn't recognize it doesn't mean anything. It's well documented in medical literature, and the idea that all drug deaths happen while people are sleeping is just an old wives' tale. It's not true. A few months later, Thompson visited Bob Cravey, a forensic toxicologist in Orange County, California. They went over the 4 main theories about Elvis's death: the Valsalva maneuver, carpet strangulation, anaphylactic shock, and polypharmacy. Only one of these theories works, Charlie, Cravey said, and it's polypharmacy. Bioscience said the same thing, and that's the bottom line. Cravey and other experts didn't agree with Francisco's idea that clinical pathologists like Eric Muirhead weren't qualified to determine the cause of death. Muirhead's colleagues, and even some of Francisco's own coworkers, pointed out that Muirhead had helped set up the medical examiner system in Dallas. By the time Elvis died, Muirhead had been in pathology for 40 years, especially focusing on cardiovascular disease and hypertension. Muirhead was upset by Francisco's ruling. Jerry claimed you had to be a forensic pathologist to determine the cause of death, Muirhead told his colleagues. I said, "But Jerry, you're crossing into my territory. I'm the expert on hypertension. I disagree with Francisco 100%. The autopsy report, which Harold Sexton wanted to be made public, included a summary of biosciences findings. It said, "The levels of drugs in Elvis's body fluids and tissues were much higher than in other known drug overdose cases involving codeine. The combination of codeine, ethchlorovinyl placidil, and barbiturates was particularly concerning. Codeine was found at levels 10 times higher than therapeutic levels. This case must be considered in terms of the cumulative effect of all the drugs found." The report identified 14 different drugs in Elvis's system, with codeine at 10 times the therapeutic level and methaqualone quaalude at a borderline toxic level. The report noted that Elvis had liver abnormalities, which could have made the drug's effects more severe. Based on the toxicology results, the case was classified as polypharmacy. The final autopsy report also pointed out that Elvis didn't die instantly. There were signs that he lived for a short time after he was stricken, including fluid in his lungs, small hemorrhages from the abdomen to the neck, swelling around the eyes, and a bluish color around the abdomen due to lack of oxygen in the blood. These signs indicated that Elvis had lived long enough for his blood vessels to hemorrhage. The Baptist Hospital's summary mentioned Elvis's enlarged heart, the narrowing of his coronary arteries, and a genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which he inherited from one parent. This condition wasn't considered significant by the hospital team, but it might explain some of the false theories about Elvis's death. The key part of the autopsy report, under toxicologic studies, said, "Based on interpretations by our experts and the literature, we believe that Elvis's death was caused by multiple drug ingestion, or polypharmacy. The combination of codeine, ethchlorovinyl, and barbiturates in his system was particularly dangerous. The levels of these drugs were much higher than in other known drug overdose cases." Even with the autopsy results, Thompson and Cole still had questions. Elvis had a history of experimenting with drugs, and there had been some close calls. Why did he cross the line on August 16, 1977? A clue came from an unexpected source. Elvis's nurse, Marion Koch, wrote in her memoir that Elvis was allergic to codeine. Elvis's longtime girlfriend, Linda Thompson, told investigators that he had a severe reaction to codeine, including a rash, shortness of breath, and panic. Elvis had picked up codeine from a dentist's office, and he called Dr. Nick at 4 a.m. asking for Dilaudid instead. The prescription for Dilaudid was filled, and Ricky Stanley picked it up and delivered it to Elvis in the bedroom. According to Dr. Nick, Elvis never took the Dilaudid, and no traces of it were found in his system. If Elvis didn't take Dilaudid, why did he take the equivalent of 10 therapeutic doses of codeine, a drug he couldn't tolerate? Dilaudid and codeine tablets look similar. Both are round and labeled with numbers indicating the dosage. Thompson and Cole believed that Elvis mistook codeine for the Dilaudid he requested and took close to 10 codeine tablets. Elvis's allergic reaction started while he was on the toilet. He felt itchy, had trouble breathing, and struggled to call for help. No one was around to assist him. With great effort he stood up, but he stumbled and fell forward on his chest, with his head to one side and his knees bent. Moments later, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was dead. Despite the official ruling, Elvis died from polypharmacy, an accidental overdose of multiple drugs. Tony Castle found his wife, Alicia, not moving. He was shocked and scared. He called the police right away. They then reached out to the Clark County office of the coroner medical examiner. Tony told the investigators that his wife was upset about an assault charge and a pending drunk driving charge, but he didn't think she would take her own life. The coroner's investigator went to the scene and found 3 types of prescription drugs. There was a plastic bottle of 200 Valium with only 5 doses left, a bottle of 100 Placidil with 6 doses left, and a bottle of 100 Elavil with 65 doses left. Alicia had been mixing all 3, plus another depressant drug that showed up later in the toxicology reports. The coroner's report said that Alicia had a history of abusing alcohol and prescription drugs every day. This habit had taken a toll on her body. The coroner recorded her height as 5 feet 6 inches and her weight as a shocking 198 pounds. The final toxicology report showed high levels of Valium diazepam, placidyl ethchloravinol, Elavil amitriptyline, and cinquin-doxepin, all depressant drugs. The coroner's office concluded that the cause of death was multiple drug toxicity. Detective Tom Dillard from the Las Vegas Police Department's Homicide Bureau said the case was closed. Our investigation showed there was no evidence to suspect her husband. We believe it was self-induced and accidental death. Alicia Kerwin Castle was 34 years old. The story of Alicia's life and death is intertwined with the larger narrative of drug abuse and its devastating effects. It's a stark reminder of how easily things can spiral out of control, even when surrounded by loved ones who are deeply concerned. Alicia's story is not unique. Many people struggle with addiction, and the consequences can be severe. Her weight gain and the mix of drugs in her system show the physical and mental toll that substance abuse can take. The toxicology report confirmed what the coroner suspected. The combination of drugs was too much for her body to handle. Detective Dillard's statement that there was no evidence to suspect her husband, Tony, adds a layer of complexity to the case. It suggests that despite the stress and the charges, the police did not find any signs of foul play. The investigation concluded that the death was accidental, likely due to the toxic mix of drugs in her system. This case highlights the importance of understanding the dangers of mixing prescription drugs and the need for support systems to help those struggling with addiction. Alicia's story is a tragic reminder of the risks involved and the devastating outcomes that can occur. As the story of Elvis Presley's life comes to a close, we look back at the people who played significant roles in his journey. Elvis's relationships, both personal and professional, were a mix of loyalty, support, and sometimes controversy. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, was a constant presence in his life. Vernon had his own struggles, including his background and his eventual death, which affected Elvis deeply. Vernon's relationship with Elvis was often overshadowed by the singer's fame, but he remained a source of support and connection to their humble beginnings. Dr. Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, was a controversial figure. He prescribed a large number of medications to Elvis, which contributed to the singer's declining health. Despite this, Elvis trusted Dr. Nichopoulos and relied on him for medical care. Elvis's drug use was a well-documented part of his life, and it had a significant impact on his health and career. His dependency on prescription drugs was a source of concern for those around him, including his friends and family. Geraldo Rivera, a journalist, played a role in bringing some of Elvis's private life and health issues to the public eye. Rivera's reports and interviews shed light on the darker aspects of Elvis's life, including his drug use and the conditions at Graceland. Dr. Earl Rose, Dr. Harold Sexton, and Dr. Max Shapiro were other medical professionals who treated Elvis. Their involvement in his care adds to the complex web of relationships that surrounded him. Elvis's friends, like Billy Smith, Gene Smith, and Red West, were part of his inner circle. They were there through the highs and lows, often providing a sense of normalcy in a life filled with extraordinary pressures. Charles C. Thompson II and James P. Cole, the authors of this book, bring their own Memphis roots and journalism experience to the story. Thompson, a veteran of the Vietnam War, worked in print and broadcast journalism, including stints at ABC 2020 and CBS 60 Minutes. Cole, also a Memphis native, spent years as a reporter and editor before transitioning into real estate and freelance writing. Through their combined efforts, they have pieced together a comprehensive and intimate portrait of Elvis Presley, a man whose life was a blend of incredible talent, personal struggles, and enduring legacy. The story of Elvis is not just about the music and the fame. It's about the people who were there with him every step of the way.